Vážené dámy, vážení pánové, ráda bych vás...
Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you at the conference Monuments and Monument Care in Czechoslovakia and other Central European countries during the second half of the 20th century on behalf of the four co-organizers, the Institute of Art History of the Academy of Science of the Czech Republic, the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes, the National Monument Institute, and the Institute for Contemporary History of the Academy of Science of the Czech Republic. Before handing over to Professor Giustino, I'd like to give you some technical information. The official launch of the conference is tomorrow at 9:45 in the morning. We will begin by official speeches of the directors of these organizations, and afterwards the conference will begin by the section entitled Architecture and Urbanism, and the next day we have Legislation and Institutions, and then the section Monument Care and Society, and finally the section Sacred Monuments and Authoritarian Regimes. At the end of the conference, we will have a lecture by Professor Richard Beagle on Thursday afternoon. The entire conference will be streamed on the YouTube channel of the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes. That is to say, there will be two channels, the Czech channel and the English channel. So the Czech presentations will be simultaneously interpreted into English and vice versa. As for the discussion, the questions, it is possible to write the questions in the chat in both channels on YouTube. And the moderator, today it's me and my husband, is going to ask those questions to the presenter. The questions that we will not have time for in the stream will be sent to the presenter, and if they can, they will answer them by writing to the person asking. So now let me hand over to my husband, Jan Uhlík, who will introduce Professor Giustino, and then we will give the floor to Professor Giustino and launch the official program by the keynote presentation about the confiscated monuments in Czechoslovakia after 1945. So we are very excited to meet you in the following days, and we wish you enjoy today's lecture as well as those in the following days. Thank you. So the keynote speaker is Cathleen Giustino, professor at College of Liberal Arts at Auburn University. She got her PhD in Central European History at Chicago University with John Boyer, Michael Geyer, and Chick Sojkovsky. She is the author of Crackdown Jewish Town, Ghetto Clearance, and the Legacy of Middle-Class Ethnic Politics in the 1900s. And she is the co-editor of the publication Socialist Escapes and Breaks from Ideology in the Everyday in Eastern Europe, 1945 to 1989. Among her newest works is the article Julia and Her Things, Restitution, Racism and Connections in and Beyond the Sudetenland, published in Bohemia Zeitschrift für Geschichte und Goethe der Böhmischen Länder, present a study entitled The Ghetto and the Castle, Modern Urban Design and Knowledge Transfer, Historic Prague, before and after 1918. In Interurban Knowledge Exchange, edited by Estelle Gantner, Heideline Kirche, and Oliver Ochado. Thanks to the participation in the Carnegie Fellows program, she did research for her current manuscript dealing with confiscated cultural heritage of Czechoslovakia. And now I have the honor to hand over to Professor Cathleen Giustino. So, Professor Giustino, the floor is yours.
Particularly thank the organizers of this very exciting and important conference. And I would especially like to thank Pani Doktorka Ulikova for inviting me to speak today and for all of her support and her inspiration over many years of research on this topic. And without further ado, I will begin my presentation. Visible today throughout the landscape of the Czech Republic are dozens of state-owned and carefully preserved castles and chateaux that were formerly the property of noble families in Bohemia and Moravia. Throughout the Cold War and after it, rooms in these former aristocratic homes have contained thoughtfully arranged displays of works of art and antique furnishings, many of them having been moved from one site to another since 1945. Again, throughout the Cold War and since that time, these elaborate buildings have been open to the public for guided tours through the installed rooms at specified times. Thus, these castles, chateaux, and the decorations inside of them became part of a network of estate museums and an important part of present-day Czech heritage. The majority of objects in this network of estate museums, including movable as well as immovable things, are and have been under the protection of trained experts in monument care working for a national heritage body headquartered in Prague. Currently, this body is the National Heritage Institute, one of the sponsors of our conference this week. A question that I want to focus on for today is how did former aristocratic and German homes and the furnishings inside of them become transformed into nationally owned and nationally managed Czech heritage objects with well-appointed rooms that have been available for public viewing since the middle of the 20th century. Certainly, we must recall that during World War II, the Czech lands did not experience the same high levels of destruction and looting that occurred in other parts of Europe. This left post-war Czechoslovakia with more cultural objects, both movable and immovable, after the war, a fact that contributed to the making of the network of estate museums. However, the limited loss of cultural property alone does not answer our question about the transformation of aristocratic and German property into national Czech heritage. In order to more deeply address our question, we must look at activities and developments in the weeks and months immediately following the defeat of the Third Reich and the end of the Nazi occupation in Czechoslovakia. It is important to emphasize at the start of this talk that these activities and developments did not take place while the Communist Party had control over Czechoslovakia's government. Indeed, the transformation of former aristocratic property began in earnest during the small but busy window of time between the end of the Nazi occupation in May of 1945 and before the Communist Party's takeover of Czechoslovakia in February of 1948. This was the time of the expulsions of 3 million Germans from Czechoslovakia and the seizures of their property, including their castles, chateaux, art, and antiques. Thus, we will be looking at a chapter in the history of historic preservation that largely occurred within roughly a 3-year window of time. What we will see when looking at this brief but complex history is the founding of a movement control system that was institutionalized within the structures of the post-war Czechoslovak state. While this institutionalized movement control system has undergone numerous changes over time, from the outset of its existence immediately after the war and up until the present day, it has functioned to contain and channel the movement of art and antiques confiscated from so-called national enemies in the Czech lands, and eventually also from so-called class enemies. Furthermore, throughout the existence of this movement control system, confiscated castles and chateaux have been part of this official set of heritage practices, serving as hubs for the sorting, storing, and public display of dispossessed interior furnishings. When looking at how state care and public use of former aristocratic and German property became embedded in the movement control system, we are going to see a complex mixing of individual agency and post-war structures. Stated differently, what we will see is that the creation of the movement control system resulted from the personal and professional ambitions of Czech individuals interested in the securement of confiscated German cultural property in the Czech lands, and their strategizing, negotiating, competing, and collaborating for control over that property within a very complicated, disordered set of post-war state institutions. These agents, the objects, and the structures were all ingredients in what I am calling the alchemy of preservation. Thus, the methodology employed in this paper will reveal a cultural politics in which personal ambitions, complicated structures, and post-war retribution combine together to contain and channel thousands of movable decorative furnishings within hundreds of immovable buildings, all of which gained the protected status of Czech national heritage. In May of 1945, Nazi power was defeated and the independent state of Czechoslovakia was restored under the leadership of President Edvard Beneš. The end of the Nazi occupation was greeted with relief and with calls for retribution. Soon the expulsions of Germans from Czechoslovakia began. Accompanying the expulsion process was the seizure of most of the Germans' property. This included the castles and chateaux of noble German families in the Czech lands and the works of art and antique furnishings inside of German homes. 2 presidential decrees legalized the dispossession of Czechoslovakia's Germans. Decree number 12, announced in June of 1945, focused on the state's confiscation of agricultural property, which included castles and chateaus. Decree number 108, issued in October of 1945, covered non-agricultural property, including urban palaces, villas, apartments, factories, and businesses belonging to Germans and German collaborators. State officials seized these buildings, and they also confiscated the contents of these buildings, including works of art and antiques. Both presidential decrees were based on the notion of the collective guilt of Germans and German collaborators. A census completed as far back as the year 1929 provided officials working for the post-war Czechoslovak state with the information that they used to decide who was a German. It did not matter that the 1929 census asked individuals to identify their mother tongue rather than their national identity, or that some people lived in mixed marriages and did not feel themselves to be exclusively German or Czech or even nationally inclined. Taken together, the presidential decrees affected an enormous number of objects in the Czech lands, both movable and immovable. For some Czechs, the fate of German cultural property was of grave concern, even before the announcement of the first presidential decree calling for confiscation. And here, at this point in my presentation, we meet one individual, that is one agent, important for understanding the construction of the movement control system that transformed private aristocratic and German property into museums open to the Czech public in the post-war period. This individual or agent who we are now meeting is Joseph Skabal. On May 7th, 1945, Josef Skabal and two of his friends responded to an appeal broadcast over the recently liberated Czechoslovak radio. The appeal urged Czech patriots to protect their country's castles and chateaux and the works of art and antiques inside them during the first chaotic days of transition from Nazi occupation to restored independence. This radio broadcast was a very early attempt to control the movement of German-owned art and antiques located in the Czech lands. Like most human beings, Josef Skabal was a complicated person who does not fit into neat categories. We begin to see his complexity when we consider his national identity. Skabal's parents were Czech patriots, and the Czech language was his primary language. None of that stopped him forever, however, from marrying a German woman who spoke little Czech. Together, the couple lived with her German-speaking father in his northern Bohemian village that was very close to the German border. Skabal was not an individual that many would consider to be a major player or a great man in the world of Czech monument care. He had written no books, developed no theories, directed no state agencies, or even studied at university. Before World War I, Skabal had been trained in window dressing, an experience that, along with his father's museum activities, inspired in him a love of collecting. Around 1918, while serving in the military, Skabal was stationed in northern Bohemia, where he met and settled down with his German wife. For income, Skabal initially sold postcards and small objects that he and his wife painted. But in quick time, his deepest personal ambition took over. He became a passionate collector of antiques, especially old print matter. During the interwar period, his love of antiques led him to frequently travel throughout northern Bohemia, where he hunted, gathered, traded, and sold objects deemed by himself and others to be collection worthy. His travels built his appreciation of the local culture and customs of northern Bohemia. These travels also advanced his knowledge of the locations of valuable objects and collections, including those that were in private German hands. Skabal's knowledge about antiques and his ambition to collect them grew expansive enough that before the Second World War began, he became a state-licensed antique dealer. The Nazi occupation dealt a hard blow to Skabal's love of collecting. Part of his collection was lost due to the spread of Nazi power in northern Bohemia. Furthermore, during the war, people had little money to spend on antiques, leaving Skabal with limited opportunities for his antique business. He emerged from the Second World War very eager to work with antiques again. Friends that he made during the war helped him with this ambition. Among his friends was Zdenek Vyt, an individual or agent of tremendous importance for the creation of the institutionalized movement control system in post-war Czechoslovakia and the transformation of former aristocratic and German homes into museums open to the Czech public. Thus, now we will meet Zdenek Vyt. Zdenek Vyt was a Czech patriot and an expert in Czech culture who dedicated his long and accomplished career to the advancement of heritage care in Czechoslovakia. Unlike Skabal, Vyt is considered to be a major player or a great man in Czech monument care. Before completing advanced studies in Czech art history at the Charles University in 1909, Vyt worked as an assistant librarian at the Museum of Decorative Arts in Prague. While employed there, Vyt became familiar with an important collection of antique furnishings and other cultural artifacts considered to be Bohemian heritage. Before the First War, Vyt compiled inventories of architectural and other heritage in Bohemia, and he served in numerous organizations dedicated to monument care, including the Club for Old Prague and the Society of the Friends for Czech Antiques. From these activities, Vyt began to learn about government administration of heritage care, and he also began to appreciate how power struggles could affect culture, both positively and negatively. Stated differently, Vyt learned about cultural politics and the strategizing, negotiation, competition, and collaboration that is often part and parcel of monument care. After the creation of independent Czechoslovakia in 1918, Vyt was put in charge of supervising the Department of Monument Care, which was within the Ministry of Education and National Enlightenment. This was one of two administrative bodies concerned with protecting historic architecture in interwar Czechoslovakia. The second of the two administrative bodies, was the State Monument Administration, which was under the jurisdiction of the Provincial Administration. Both of these two bodies operated separately from one another, meaning that, in structural terms, state monument care in interwar Czechoslovakia was fragmented rather than concentrated or focused. Neither of the two interwar state bodies responsible for monument care had a lot of power. Neither could do little more than compile inventories of historic objects and observe their conditions. During the interwar period, Vyt tried to secure the passage of a national preservation law that would better protect heritage in Czechoslovakia. His attempts were unsuccessful, however, with such a national law first being passed many years later in 1958. In 1938, shortly before the start of World War II, Vyt retired from his administrative position at the ministry, in part being pushed out of that position due to politics. This was a time of rising threats from Nazi Germany, and in some government circles, Vyt was considered to be too soft of a Czech nationalist. Here we see a struggle for government influence over culture. And we can see here that Vyt was no stranger to competition for power over culture. We can further see his experience with cultural politics when we look at his rivalry with another very important historic preservationist. This other very important historic preservationist was Vatslav Wagner, who worked with the state monument administration mentioned above. In the early 1940s, Wagner published an article that challenged Vyt's theory of best practices for monument care. Vyt advocated for a more purist approach, whereas Wagner promoted a more synthetic approach. Vyt was very critical of Wagner's views, and a divide opened up between the two men and between their respective friends and allies. Wagner sent Vyt a letter in which he tried to make peace, but Vyt never seemed to have forgiven Wagner, even after the war, as we'll see later in this talk. Once the Nazi occupation ended, Vyt was very interested in the restored Czechoslovak state's confiscation of German castles, chateaux, art, and antiques. Vyt presented a patriotic reason for his interest. In at least one interest, Vyt referred to the post-war confiscations of German property as atonement for the Battle of White Mountain in 1618. Another reason for his interest in property, cultural property confiscated from Germans, was Vyrt's genuine concern that these confiscated objects be well cared for and under the supervision of people whom he considered to be knowledgeable about and respectful of Czech heritage. Vyt was also very confident that he personally had the necessary experience in art history and also the necessary experience in the administration of culture to ensure proper protection of these objects. He did not want the art and antiques to be lost due to looting, plundering, or other unregulated movement. Furthermore, he did not want somebody lacking in what he considered to be proper knowledge to be in charge of caring for the cultural property seized from expelled Germans. Excuse me, just needed to loosen up a little bit. During the first tumultuous weeks and months following the Nazi defeat, Vyt was well informed about the fate of cultural objects being seized from Germans. He gained his information from two main sources. One source of his information about the fate of confiscated cultural property was his work with the National Land Commission, which was responsible for supervising the confiscation of castles and chateaus. That was agricultural property. The other source of Vyrt's information about confiscated cultural property was his friend Josef Skabal, whose detailed, emotion-filled letters helped to inform Vyt about the situation on the ground at various former German properties in northern Bohemia. Vyt and Skabal both saw that in the immediate post-war period, there existed very little effective supervision or securement of cultural objects taken from Germans. It was very apparent to these two individuals or agents that there existed no government body dedicated to the protection and preservation of German-owned castles, chateaux, art, and antiques. The Benish presidential decrees pertaining to the dispossession of Germans were mentioned above. Those decrees contained no rules or guidelines for the care and safekeeping of cultural objects seized from Germans. Thus, instead of one dominant, concentrated state structure caring for confiscated cultural property, a number of old and new state bodies were involved in taking objects from German homes, deciding where those things would stay or go, and sometimes not keeping a very careful eye on confiscated art and antiques. Lines of jurisdiction separating the state bodies were vague, with areas of overlap between some offices and their administrative reach. This structural fragmentation and confusion created circumstances favorable for competition among Czechs for command over German art and antiques. Stated differently, the messy, disordered nature of the Czechoslovak state in the weeks and months following the Third Reich's defeat provided a framework for struggles among Czechs over German property. Eventually, though, one set of human agents, one sway, one control over the competing structural elements and built the institutionalized movement control system that governed objects seized from Germans. At the forefront of this group, that one control, were Skabal and Vyt. Both men found ways to pursue their personal and professional ambitions within the structural disorder of the post-war Czechoslovak state. Now, at this point in my presentation, I want to talk in more detail about the structural character of the post-war Czechoslovak state. And I want to talk about some bodies within that disordered state that were concerned with the preservation of cultural property seized from expelled Germans and German collaborators. I'm going to warn you in advance that this is a difficult topic to narrate on account of the multiple shifting and overlapping parts of the state in the immediate post-war period. If you feel confused as I speak, I urge you to imagine the confusion that state officials and ordinary people on the ground in post-war Czechoslovakia must have felt. If you feel confused as I speak, I also urge you to imagine how ambitious individuals could employ the structural messiness of the post-war state to create opportunities for achieving their goals through negotiation, conflict, competition, and collaboration. An important part of my findings is that this structural disorder of the state was itself an element in the alchemy of historic preservation in post-war Czechoslovakia. The confusing, overlapping nature of government bodies responsible for monument care, along with the agency of some ambitious individuals in a time of mass expulsion and dispossession, combined together in the creation of the movement control system and the transformation of former aristocratic homes into Czech national heritage even before the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia in February of 1948. That is my ultimate argument for this paper, the ultimate findings of my research at this point. So we're going to now meet the first state body that I want to talk about. And I'm not going to tell you about all of the state bodies that were involved in monument care immediately after World War II. That would really be confusing. But I'm going to tell you about 4 state bodies. The first state body that I wanted to talk about was the Provincial National Committee. The Provincial National Committee served as the provisional administration for the running of day-to-day government matters in the western half of Czechoslovakia, starting on May 11th, 1945. Among its many concerns and problems and challenges, members of the Provincial National Committee worried about the uncontrolled movement of German art and antiques after the war ended. They wanted attention to the securement and protection of these things. Almost immediately, the Provincial National Committee undertook efforts to control the unregulated movement of art and antique furnishings confiscated from expelled Germans and German collaborators. On May 18th, 1945, in order to try and control the movement of confiscated cultural property, the Provincial National Committee created a new state agency. This new state agency was called the Securement Commission. The Securement Commission is our second body today, and it's very important for this talk. The Securement Commission resulted from an early state effort to build a movement control system for art and antiques confiscated from Germans. The Securement Commission was given the power to identify, secure, and protect works of art and antique furnishings found in German homes, including castles and chateaux. Very interestingly for us, the Securement Commission had only 3 members, and one of those members was Josef Skabal. The other members were his 2 friends who had responded with him to the radio broadcast to protect castles and chateaux that was broadcast on May 7th, 1945. So Skabal became a member of the Securement Commission with his 2 wartime buddies. The primary tasks of the Securement Commission were going through the possessions found in German-owned castles and chateaux in northern Bohemia, the former Sudetenland. They identified works of art and antique furnishings among those possessions and then fixed those objects in place, that is, securing them in place, so as to help guarantee that they were not smuggled, plundered, or lost in some other unregulated, non-state controlled movement. To help fix those objects in place, Skabal and his 2 friends recorded inventories of the art and antique furnishings that they found in confiscated castles and chateaux. And then, as an added security measure, they also locked those objects in rooms, which were then sealed with paper slips announcing that the rooms and the things within them had been secured by the Securement Commission. A torn paper seal was evidence that someone else had gone into a locked room and had taken something of value without official permission. Skabal worked exceptionally hard on the Securement Commission. Given his passion for collecting, this was as perfect of employment as he could find in the post-war context of economic hardship and the large-scale dispossession of art and antiques. His knowledge of northern Bohemia, including about significant collections in the area, made him well-suited for the job. It is likely that his friend Zdenek Vyt helped him to get the job. While working on the Securement Commission, Skabal sent Vyt letters informing Vyt of his activities and observations. Skabal and the other members of the Securement Commission also stayed in contact with the Provincial National Committee, which had hired them. In one letter to the Provincial National Committee, Skabal and his friends requested that no other government body be allowed to secure cultural valuables in the castles and chateaux of northern Bohemia. Skabal did not want the work of the Securement Commission to be, quote, crisscrossed and unnecessarily complicated, end quote. Stated differently, Skabal did not want any competition from any other state agencies in his securement activities. He wanted the Securement Commission to have unchallenged authority over dispossessed, movable cultural objects. The Provincial National Committee seemed ready to honor this request, but there was a problem, and that was that the Provincial National Committee appeared unaware of the fact that an older pre-existing state body was also securing art and antiques found in German castles and chateaux in northern Bohemia. This other older state body was the State Monument Administration, created during the interwar period and mentioned above. The State Monument Administration was a third body involved in the securement of confiscated cultural property after the Nazi defeat. Again, if you're feeling confused by all the state bodies, imagine what people on the ground in post-war Czechoslovakia must have felt. And also imagine how this structural disorder, this structural messiness, opened up opportunities for strategizing, negotiation, competition, and collaboration among ambitious individuals or agents. In June of 1945, the State Monument Administration established a branch office in northern Bohemia, and its employees began carrying out this very same work of the Securement Commission, and doing so in the very same castles and chateaux where Skabal had carried out securement activities. So we see here some of the overlap and redundancy of state bodies becoming very visible. More specifically, we see that competition between the Securement Commission and the State Monument Administration became very evident. Josef Skabal was quite upset about the securement activities of the State Monument Administration in northern Bohemia. He recorded his anger and his despair in emotion-filled letters that he sent to Zdenek Vyt. Skabal criticized the lack of professionalism of his competitors, one of whom he castigated for riding around atop a vehicle while carrying a machine gun. Skabal lamented how seals placed on doors at the Friedland Castle had been broken and windows were left open so that thieves could easily enter. He criticized shoddy inventories that failed to mention valuable furnishings, including some from the Lemberg Chateau, where the State Monument Administration arranged for American diplomats to be entertained. Skabal strongly suggested that employees of the State Monument Administration were stealing art and antiques found in German castles and chateaux. Police investigations ensued, with one purported culprit leaving his job at the State Monument Administration and moving to South America. In addition, there was also another source of conflict between the Securement Commission and the State Monument Administration that I must mention. This was a personal source of conflict, And that was because the post-war director of the State Monument Administration was Vatslav Wagner. As was mentioned above, Wagner was a leading historic preservationist who had differing views about best ways to care for heritage than did Zdenek Vyt. During the Second World War, Wagner became a rival of Vyrt's when Wagner advocated for an alternative way of monument care. An intense and permanent rift had formed between Wagner and Vyt and between their respective friends and allies. Vyrt's friends, as we know, included Skabal in the Securement Commission. Wagner's supporters worked for the State Monument Administration. As we'll see in a minute, the Provincial National Committee also gave its support to Wagner. This intellectual, personal disagreement, in combination with the structural disorder of the state, created a powerful set of forces contributing to the struggle over German art and antiques and to the alchemy of historic preservation in post-war Czechoslovakia. So at this point, we have learned something about the complicated state structures involved in heritage care in post-war Czechoslovakia. Next, we will observe how the activities of ambitious individuals or agents working in or around those structures mix together to create the institutionalized movement control system and the transformation of former aristocratic and German property into national Czech heritage. In early July of 1945, the Provincial National Committee examined its ability to secure art and antiques confiscated from German castles and chateaux. The Provincial National Committee realized that it lacked the money and staff needed for effective protection of these movable objects. It also had learned by that point that the State Monument Administration, under the direction of Wagner, had the resources and the power to care for cultural property taken from Germans. Thus, in early July 1945, the Provincial National Committee asked the State Monument Administration to serve as the executive organ responsible for the securement of German art and antiques. Vatslav Wagner, director of the State Monument Administration, accepted this offer. With this change, the Securement Commission, consisting of Skabal and his friends, was no longer necessary. With this change, the Securement Commission was dissolved after having been in existence for less than 2 months. Needless to say, Skabal was very upset about the closing down of the Securement Commission. He was now out of a job during lean times. Furthermore, he was out of a job caring for the types of collectible objects that he loved. Additionally, Zdenek Vyt was very upset about the closing down of the Securement Commission. His rival, Vatslav Wagner, was now in charge of overseeing efforts to secure cultural property taken from Germans. Wagner's position, along with the worrisome contents of Skabal's letters, made Vyt extremely concerned about the fate of art and antiques confiscated from Germans. Vyt feared that the Czechoslovak state would experience tremendous cultural loss. Wagner's position also threatened Vyrt's ability to participate in the preservation of confiscated cultural property and to control the fate of those things. In response to his growing worries, during the summer of 1945, Vyt began to work on a plan. This was a plan that could help him gain authority over art and antiques taken from Germans. In this plan, Vyt strove to create a distinct body within the state that would have the power to control the mobility and immobility of movable cultural objects found in German-owned castles and chateaux. Vyt called this state body that he wanted to create the National Cultural Commission. Employees of this National Cultural Commission would go through German homes, identifying valuable art and antiques to be protected as national heritage, and then move those objects to state-approved, state-controlled storage sites for preservation. In sum, what Vyt was proposing with his plan for the National Cultural Commission was the creation of an institutionalized movement control system with concentrated and dominant authority over confiscated cultural objects. Initially, Vyt hoped that he could convince President Beneš to announce a presidential decree that would call the National Cultural Commission into being. When that did not happen, Vyt, who remained in regular communications with Skabal, needed to find another means to have the National Cultural Commission become a bureaucratic reality, an administrative reality within the structures of the Czechoslovak state. Vyt knew that in the spring of 1946, the Czechoslovak parliament would be reconstituted and start passing laws for the recovering economy, the recovering country. This was still a time period before the Communist Party achieved control over the country in February of 1948. So Vyt took his plan for the creation of the National Cultural Commission, and he drafted a legislative bill to be voted on in the national parliament. This legislative bill called for the creation of the National Cultural Commission with unrivaled, concentrated power to secure and control the movement of confiscated art and antiques. On May 16, 1946, almost 1 year after the end of the Nazi occupation, Vyrt's bill was passed in the national parliament. Once the National Cultural Commission became operative, its employees had unrivaled, concentrated command over art and antiques confiscated from Germans. In time, the National Cultural Commission also gained jurisdiction and power over individual German-owned castle chateaus, and eventually also over cultural objects seized from Czechs who were deemed to be class enemies. I want to emphasize something important and interesting about the passage of Vyrt's bill to create the National Cultural Commission. I want to emphasize that leaders of the Provincial National Committee were very surprised about Vyrt's bill. Archival documents show that leaders in the Provincial National Committee did not know that Vyrt's legislative proposal to create the National Cultural Commission was being presented and voted on in the parliament. They only learned about the appearance of Vyrt's bill in the national parliament after it had been passed as law. Leaders of the Provincial National Committee sent letters to parliamentary representatives asking them to vote against the creation of the National Cultural Commission. Replies that they received, however, said it was too late to ask for help. The bill had already been passed. Did Vyt intentionally outmaneuver his competition by not discussing plans for his bill with them? It is entirely possible. It is possible that this expert in cultural administration had carried out a power play within the structures of the disordered state. Not a power play for power in and of itself, but a power play for the authority to control the movement of German cultural valuables and to ensure that people whom he considered to be most qualified and his allies were caring for them. The National Cultural Commission officially began its operations in January of 1947. That is more than a year before the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia. Zdenek Vyt became the director of the National Cultural Commission, and one of the key employees of the National Cultural Commission was Josef Skabal, who carried out selections of art and antiques to be assigned the protected status of Czechoslovak heritage. Vyt, like Skabal, never joined the Communist Party. Yet both men were aware of political shifts underway in Czechoslovakia, shifts that ultimately resulted in the communist takeover of the country in February of 1948. Vyt and Skabal knew that some Communist Party members were not favorable to saving relics of the old aristocratic order at state expense. In light of this knowledge, Vyt developed a plan for helping to make the preservations of castles, chateaux, and luxurious furnishings acceptable to Communist Party leaders. In Vyrt's plan, castles and chateaux of exceptional architectural value were to be protected as examples of particular artistic styles from the past. In this plan, these special castles and chateaux were to be converted into museums with rooms decorated to show visitors how aristocrats lived in the past. Skabal helped Vyt to identify confiscated art and antiques for the decoration of these rooms, and in this way, these cultural properties confiscated from Germans became part of the network of estate museums that were open to the Czech public and remain open to visitors until today. In 1952, due to a large-scale reorganization of the state administration, the National Cultural Commission was dissolved, and its powers were transferred to a division for monument protection within the Ministry of Education, Science, and Art. The institutionalized movement control system and the network of estate museums that grew out of the National Cultural Commission were transferred with it and thereby continued to exist. It continues to exist until the present day, of course, with some refinements and modifications. There is a lot more that I could say about the movement control system and the network of estate museums built out of confiscated cultural property. For now, though, I would like to conclude with some brief observations that I find of particular relevance for our conference together this week. Clearly, the study of monument care has much to offer. From it, we can learn about the history of architecture and art, and also about the everyday lives of people living in the past. From it, we can also gain insight into the structural composition of governments, and very importantly, from the study of monument care, we can learn about opportunities for ambitious individuals to practice agency, even in very limiting and challenging structural circumstances. From the study of monument care, we can learn about the roles of competition and collaboration in the construction of heritage and deepen our appreciation of cultural politics. In sum, I hope that my presentation on the alchemy of preservation has deepened our appreciation of how the complex mixing of agency, structures, and objects can shape the history of heritage. I thank you all for your attention. Děkuji vám za pozornost.
Děkuji moc paní profesorce za její
Many thanks to Professor Giustino for this lecture, which gave us insight to probably the most complex situation in which the Czech monument care has ever found itself, that is, in the first years after the end of the Second World War. Now I would like to launch the discussion. As I said at the beginning, you can write your questions in the chat on the Czech or on the English YouTube channel. And I'm going to read those questions to Professor Giustino, who is going to answer. First of all, I have a question myself. Professor Giustino, do you believe that under these conditions, after the war, do you think that to save those objects and buildings, was it possible to do more? I know it's not an easy question. I was asked this question often, and I have reflected upon it quite a lot, but I'd like to know your view.
You are asking if it would have been possible to do more to protect monuments in that immediate post-war period. I think this is an excellent question. I actually think, given the circumstances, given how chaotic things were on the ground, given the number of state actors and private actors, given the economic circumstances, given some of the psychological unsettlement that people felt at this time, given all of the movements of peoples back and forth at this time, that it's really quite remarkable that as much was saved as it was. I don't know that something better or more could have been done. I think that people like Skabal and Vyt had already been thinking about the best ways to preserve heritage, both movable and immovable, during the war. They anticipated that there would be a lot of opportunities for plundering and the disappearance of objects. And so I think they were already thinking about things that could be done immediately after the war. And I think that radio broadcast that we both went looking for is evidence of the fact that they really were aware of just how threatening the situation was for movable and immovable objects, and that they worked to their best abilities with the situation that they had. They also worked very closely with the friendships and connections that they had. They were very astute about cultural politics, both in terms of institutional opportunities, but also in terms of personal connections. I think that one way, perhaps, that there could have been improvement, although I don't know if it would have happened a lot quicker, would have been if in the presidential decrees, President Beneš had outlined a much clearer set of guidelines for the securement of cultural property. Or if he had indeed announced a presidential decree that would have been dedicated specifically to rules about the securement of cultural property, the storage of that property, who could be involved with that property. But there were so many other things going on at that time that it was difficult. Now, of course, something else that could be said is that if the expulsions of the Germans hadn't happened, or hadn't happened at the rate in which they happened, that perhaps there would not have been the need for such protection of cultural property. But then maybe some of that property would have disappeared by other means, perhaps not through damage, but through being smuggled across the border or hidden by different means. But I think this is an excellent question, in large part because it shows us just how complicated, and we've talked about this many times, how difficult these initial weeks and months after World War II are to study for heritage care after World War II. But I think this is a very important question for helping us to appreciate the complexity of the situation in terms of personal, institutional, and social and ethnic relations in those weeks, months, and first years right after the end of the Nazi occupation. So thank you for your question. I hope I have done an adequate job of answering it. If you would like to add your own opinion, I would be glad to hear it. And I'm sure other people would like to hear it as well.
Já se musím přiznat, že se mi opravdu četla.
I have to say that I totally agree with what you said, word for word. My view is identical based on what I have read, found out so far about the situation. I have the same view. And now we have some questions from our audience. So let me read the first one. The alchemy in the title of your talk. Could you say more about alchemy?
Or could you repeat it, perhaps? Is it about the name? Is it about the use of the term alchemy? The use of the term alchemy in my presentation? Yes, okay. I chose this language. I chose this term alchemy of preservation for two primary reasons. And one is it speaks to the fact that we need to look at a combination of factors in order to understand the complexity of the building of this network of estate museums. We cannot have a reductionist approach only looking at personalities or structures or objects, or even just looking at this mixture at one moment of time. We need to consider how this is a process of bringing together different elements, and also really a process of discovery, okay? Vyt and Skabal, they did not know what they would end up with. The original goal was not to create the National Cultural Commission. This was something that was developed and discovered along the way, similar to the way that alchemists in Prague were involved in a mixing process that was a process of discovery. They did not have the initial recipe that they needed for making gold. They never actually found that recipe, but they knew that by trying to mix things together, or that they knew that by different factors coming together, you could achieve different results, and maybe it would be the results you wanted. So that's a big reason why I chose this word alchemy. The other reason why I chose the word alchemy is because for me, it is a very Prague. It reminds me of Prague. It evokes Prague and Czech culture for me. My preliminary research and some of my research still today is concerned with the history of Prague. And I really wish I was in Prague now. I really wish we were all together in Prague now, having this symposium together in Prague. So those are the two main reasons why I chose the language of alchemy. So one, it speaks to the methodology of mixing together structures. The other is because I do think it speaks to Czech heritage. And if this use of the word invokes other senses in people, I would be interested in hearing about them. If anybody thinks it's not the right word to use, I would be interested in hearing about it.
No, moc děkuji. Se tady teď...
Thank you. Thank you for your answer.
No, v pořádku, se mi to podařilo.
I am sorry, I'm experiencing some technical issues, but it seems fine now. So thank you for your answer. Again, I totally agree with you. And we've got another question from our audience. Do I understand it correctly that the institutions that you've been talking about were created initially in the northern Bohemia and then were introduced in the rest of the Republic? What about Prague?
Of Prague. I was thinking of it more in terms of other parts of Bohemia and also Moravia and then also Slovakia. So what I have done here is I've tried to give as much of a bird's eye view of the development of this movement control system, recognizing, as this question recognizes, that there is a lot of diversity in the history of monument care in Czechoslovakia overall, and also in what is now the Czech Republic. So what I have talked about here is more, I think, in keeping with castles and chateaux outside of Prague. Prague, some of the buildings inside of Prague fell under, as far as I know, and I'm not as well versed in this as I'd like to be, fell under it would have been jurisdiction of the magistrat, and also some of the buildings fell under the jurisdiction of various ministries. So various ministries gained control over palaces in Prague, or over other monuments such as the Bethlehemské Chapel. So this is a story that, in terms of the buildings, and then also there are the galleries. They're going to fall under the purview of a variety of other ministries at the central government level, but then also at the local municipal level. Regarding some of the movable objects that were in Prague, they also sometimes fell under the jurisdiction of institutions in Prague, such as the National Gallery or the Museum of Decorative Arts. Although sometimes we have examples of struggles between the National Cultural Commission and some of these other cultural institutions for control over paintings or particularly valuable antiques. And then there were some instances in which Vyt, as director of the National Cultural Commission, worked closely with these institutions, said, here we have a painting, or we have a piece of glass or a piece of ceramics that we really think should go with this other institution. And he would help to transfer jurisdiction or control of that movable object to the other institution. And we also see this very well with some of the collaboration between the National Cultural Commission and the Jewish Museum. There were times when Vyt and Skabal came across artifacts that had been taken from Jews by the Nazis, okay, not as part of the confiscations of the Germans, and then they would work to help to get those artifacts to the preservationists at the Jewish Museum. And so these are examples of collaboration for monument care. A lot of what I talked about today was competition in this early period, but I wanted to be sure to also point out that collaboration is also very critical for the building of heritage in the Czech context and any context as well. And I know that I have only partially answered your question. It's an excellent one, but it's also a very big question. And this question could be applied to Moravia as well, I believe. Also, I think to southern Bohemia, where some of the Czech castles and chateaux were, things taken from the Schwarzenbergs under the Lex Schwarzenberg. And then it could be applied to Slovakia, which had a very different history with different institutions. And there will be a paper in this conference on Slovakia. I was very happy to see, and I very much look forward to that paper and the other papers as well. Thank you very much for your question.
Děkuji za odpověď, jenom připomenu.
Thank you for your answer. I would like to remind you that Professor Kowalski's presentation about the situation in Slovakia will take place on Wednesday morning. And I have the next question from our audience. Outside of the high art framework, what do we know about the processes of transformation of material culture of Czech Germans into the Czech national heritage after the Second World War?
This is an extremely important question, and this is a very difficult question to answer. And for me, this is one of the central questions to answer because it can involve the erasing of memories of German heritage in the Czech past. The word Czech, as you know, is a word that can have two meanings, although it doesn't translate as such so well into English. It can mean Bohemian and it can mean ethnic Czech. So the processes of transforming the German, I'm going to call it confiscated property, into Czech heritage has, I would say, two general sets of processes. One is the more sort of physical processes of taking it out of German hands, stopping it from being legal German property through these confiscations, and then putting it in the hands of state institutions that were controlled by Czechs while Germans were being physically removed from the state. Okay? So this is one part of the process in which these things that were owned by Germans are transferred from German hands to Czech hands in legal administrative terms. And some might say this was illegal, okay? I would say it could be said that it was illegitimate, but still there's a transfer of property in legal administrative terms from German hands to Czech hands. And this is something that the National Cultural Commission is doing, and the various bodies that are taking this property out of German homes and then moving it to storage sites or putting it on display in the museums, or in some cases eventually selling it. This is not something that I'm talking about. Some of this stuff though, during the 1950s and 1960s that was taken out of German homes was eventually sold through state institutions, official state antique businesses, Starožitnost and Antikva. These are part of the processes of making things German, taking things that were German and making them Czech. But there's a more complicated, more less physical, more cultural and invisible process that's going on. And this is the process of, I would say, erasing the memories of the original owners of these properties and instilling new memories about the substance or the cultural nature of these objects through more ideological means. And this is done largely, but not only, but I'll talk about this because I know about it best. This is done largely through the tours that were carried out during the 1950s, 1960s, and later in the estate museums. So groups of school children, groups of factory workers, families on weekend výlety, weekend outings, would go to castles and chateaus that had been former German property, but now were museums open to the Czech public. And they would be led on tours of these former homes of Germans. They would not hear much, however, about the Germans that lived there. They might hear something about how the Soviet Union and the Communist Party had rescued the people from the old exploiting class and now had taken this property that had been made with the blood of the people and the sweat of the people and turned it back over to the hands of the people. Okay? In this official narrative that was delivered in brochures and in guide tours of castles and chateaux during the socialist period, knowledge about the Germans who owned this stuff was not part of the narrative. Okay? So in this way, in these narratives, there was an erasure of knowledge about the original owners of these objects and a replacement of that knowledge with a new set of memories. Okay? And in a way, knowledge of the confiscated origins of these castles, chateaux, and some wonderful furnishings became what was known as a bila mista, a bila misto, a blank spot in Czech history during the socialist period, something that was rediscovered after the end of the Cold War. So I hope I've partly, at least satisfactorily, answered this very, very important question about how German things can become Czech things, that it's both a physical, legal, juridical process, but also a cultural, ideological process. And if anybody would like to add anything to this question, I would be very happy to hear your views on it, because this is something that I think about a lot. If you're interested a little bit more in this, I do have an article published on this, treating Ratiborzice in the edited volume Socialist Escapes. Okay.
Ano, moc děkuji za odpověď. Článek
Thank you very much. The article you mentioned was published in a publication dedicated to Zdenek Vyt, published in 2004, I believe. Let's go to the next question. Thank you for an excellent lecture. I wonder how many confiscated buildings were transformed into museums?
Answer, because the number has changed over time. And I don't have all of the statistics with me. I can tell you that from a report, a government report in 1958, a total of 131 castles and chateaux had become protected monuments. Not all of them, though, were turned into museums by 1958. I would say by that time, maybe 40 or 50 were museums. It took time to transform all of these buildings into museums. A lot of them needed restoration work. Some of them were not in very good shape. And then there were a lot of shifts in the government going on. There were a lot of transfers in monument care. And Dr. Ulikova will tell us a little bit more about some of these changes in her presentation this week. And so maybe Dr. Ulikova, could you say how many castles and chateaux are now museums in the present day? I know there are even more since the end of the Cold War. Over 100 though, yes?
No, tam do těch 50. let byl nárůst.
Well, before the 50s, they were about 130, but this included some monasteries. So the question is how we defined confiscated monuments or nationalized monuments. Speaking about the confiscated monuments from private owners, they were about 130. In the 1960s, the number grew a bit. But after the Velvet Revolution, the number went down again, of course, as the monuments were returned to the Czech owners and to the church. I'm not sure how many of these buildings are administered by the Czech Monument Institute. It's about 100, I would say.
I can say that I have been to 32 museums in castles and chateaux, all of them in Bohemia, and I have not been to everyone. And some are now private, like Dobříš. It was actually different because it was under the control of the Union of Czechoslovak Writers, with a little museum in it, but it's now back in private hands. So it's a hard number to say, but clearly we can say dozens, that there are many. Yeah. So I can also say that the first one that was converted into a museum was Litomyšl, and the second one that was converted into a museum was Ratiboržice, as the museum to babička, to grandmother. So we really see there the early beginnings of installation practices using confiscated cultural property. And we also see there some of the ways in which the National Cultural Commission was beginning to practice that movement control system, moving objects that had been confiscated from Germans around between different castles and chateaux. And then the number grew as Czech confiscated cultural property was joined into the network as well. And I see another question here about comparing what I discussed to other European countries. Should I go ahead and begin to address that question?
Ano, můžete.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
I'm not trying to destroy the order here.
Jenom to by byla poslední
Maybe
otázka.
just remark, this will be the last question for today. And the remaining questions will be sent to Professor Giustino, and if she is available, she will send the answer by writing later. Yes, I will be happy to do that. So the last question, can you make a comparison with similar European countries? I'm going to put my email address in the chat so people can contact me.
What happened in Czechoslovakia to other countries is also an excellent, excellent question. And one reason I think that this is a very exciting and important conference is because this is a conference in which there will be a lot more comparative work done. It is my opinion that to date, we have not had a lot of comparative work. It has been difficult for me to understand what's been going on in other countries and to do comparison because I have not found a lot of work. There is some work. I could say, though, that preliminarily, one important difference between the Czech or Czechoslovak context is the fact that so much more was not destroyed during World War II. So we can go to former East Germany and we can see confiscated castles and chateaux. Or we can go to Poland and we can see some protected castles and chateaux that are now state heritage. But they do not have the same wealth of movable objects in them in most cases. And that's because those countries and other countries in Western Europe experienced more devastation and destruction during World War II. And then there's also the case of France, where they had the French Revolution much earlier, back in the end of the 18th century, where a lot of the aristocratic property was confiscated and turned into state property. And some of it disappeared during the revolution. Now, France, of course, has a wealth of heritage, but not all of it is the same type of heritage that we'll see in these confiscated castles and chateaux that I talked about today. So I really, really look forward to hearing the other papers because they will help to enrich our ability to understand comparative developments in heritage care across the European context. And eventually, I hope that we also have more opportunities to compare heritage care across other global contexts. And there are many, many more areas of heritage care that we could learn from due to comparisons, including how inventories were kept, including how museums were set up, including practices of selling things that were considered heritage, including processes of erasing the memories of the original owners. So an excellent question and a lifetime of work for many individuals. So, and I look forward to possibilities for collaboration with anybody who's interested in this question and many others regarding heritage. So again, I thank everybody for your attention, and I thank you all for your questions, and I thank the organizers for their hard work, and I thank Pani Dr. Ulikova for inviting me to talk today.
Já také moc děkuji paní profesorce, že pozvání.
Many thanks to you, Professor Giustino, for being with us, for your excellent keynote lecture, and for your answers that were not just formal answers, they were profound, broad. So thank you very much. I would like to invite you for tomorrow's program, which starts at 9:45, and we will speak about architecture and urbanism in Czechoslovakia and other countries of the Eastern Bloc in the totalitarian period. So many thanks for your attention, and I hope to see you tomorrow and in the next days of the conference. I believe everyone will find the thing that interests you. Many thanks and have a nice evening. Goodbye.